Hello, welcome to the Possibility Club. It's 2021 now, and a very happy new year to you. After a short break, we're back with the second half of the After Corona podcast series. When we started publishing these interviews in June 2020, I figured we'd have a few months to cover as much ground as we could. But a few months turned into 6, and it has been fascinating to listen to and to mix the voices from across different stages of lockdown, easing, frustration, hope, and the very different lived experiences within that. The impact has not been at all universal, with some testimonials aching with anxiety. I found the early healthcare and charity episodes particularly moving. But even the most sceptical of contributors has made it clear that going back to the status quo just simply isn't an option. The arts, hospitality and education, they will have been changed forever in some ways. Good ways, bad ways. Architects, opera singers and business coaches alike have found new relationships with human connections through online platforms, and they've been generous in talking us through what that means for their businesses. So we'll keep going for another 6 months, I think, with the anxieties and hopes from 2020 that we've still yet to release. We've got some really exciting clips to publish, mixed with new thoughts about what next now, as vaccinations try to outrun the mutated strains of this bloody virus. As ever, we'll be asking people about their experiences and about post-traumatic growth. What is it that we're learning? What is it that's changing? What is it that needs to change? We've got some fantastic interviews lined up already, from airline captains, TV producers, songwriters and priests, to engineers, tech entrepreneurs, venue owners and journalists. To kick off the new year, we're going to zoom in right now on politics, most specifically on power and action, and where it comes from when it seems like a big era-defining moment when decisions are needing to be made every day. And my special guest who's going to walk us through that is Stella Creasy, MP for Walthamstow in North East London since 2010. Early on in her parliamentary career, Stella gained recognition for her successful campaigning on payday loan companies, leading to better regulation of exploitative interest rates, even winning accolades from the Conservative press and the then Tory Chancellor George Osborne. As a politician, Stella Creasy is known for direct and detailed interrogation of social injustice, with attention given to issues such as abortion rights for women in Northern Ireland and the consideration of misogyny as a hate crime. She sat on the Labour front benches as Shadow Minister for Business and for Crime Prevention, and following the birth of her daughter just over a year ago, Stella has worked to improve maternity rights for female MPs, including employing herself the first ever locum MP to cover some of her constituency work when she needed to care for her daughter, a bit of a groundbreaking first in the history of Westminster. Prior to being elected to the House of Commons, Stella worked for think tanks and political movements and as a parliamentary researcher, and at a time she was head of public affairs for the Scouting Association. I spoke to Stella towards the end of November 2020 about power, about community organising, about social mobility, and about what the hell it's like being a British MP through a decade of austerity, Brexit, and a global pandemic. I'm joined on the Possibility Club podcast by Stella Creasy, MP for Walthamstow. Delighted to be speaking with you. Thank you. It's really miserable weather where I am down on the south coast. What's it like in East London today?
Equally miserable. I might force my daughter to sit in a pram and go round the playground just for the sake of getting some air, but I doubt she'll have much fun.
It's a good idea. You're a fairly newish mum, aren't you?
Yes.
And how is she enjoying a global pandemic? Is it something she got much to say on it?
Well, it's one of the few bright spots about, because obviously I've been doing quite a lot of work with mums and with new parents in the pandemic because they seem to have been forgotten. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of them are losing their jobs or they've had very traumatic births because of the restrictions on partners and the way that the NHS is currently constructed. They're quite worried about what it means for their children. I can understand that concern because normally perhaps they would have had to go to baby groups and had lots of socialisation, and obviously they can't do as much of that at the moment. My daughter seems to be coping admirably, which is a lovely respite from everything else to come and just watch a lot of Hey Dougie.
Yes, well, that's what Hey Dougie's for, I think. But no, I think you're right.
I do find myself starting to refer to people as squirrels. I think it has a negative effect in some other context, I have to be honest.
Well, I think that could brighten Parliament up, and maybe we'll come to that in a second. But the impact on children and parents, as you say, is in some cases extremely profound and concerning. But in other cases, we might not even know for quite some time, actually, what the impact of this, the impact on mental health.
I mean, we know that mums were 10 percentage points more likely than dads to be furloughed, and therefore they're much further on in the process of redundancy. So the latest figures that we got in September showed that disproportionately women, and it's disproportionately mums, were losing their jobs. And a lot of that comes down to some very practical things, that basically there's not a lot of childcare. And obviously with the schools not being back fully or people having to self-isolate, I was talking to my local authority and there are thousands of children over the last couple of months who've had to self-isolate at some point. It's been mums who've picked up the slack in terms of trying to balance that with working, the fallacy of working from home. And it's something that we're trying desperately to get the government to focus on and preempt, because otherwise we could see women's employment set back 50, 60 years through no fault of their own. If you think about things that sort of horrify you, this week there was a piece in the Daily Mail about how women were 23% more likely to be, mums were 23% more likely to be losing their jobs than dads. So what they needed was a mummy salary from their husbands so that they could have coffees. And you kind of were, it was like,
pin money.
I've read about Gilead, but don't really want to live there. If people want to choose to be at home, that is very different from women losing their jobs because the childcare that we've all paid for doesn't exist right now.
Indeed, absolutely. No, I've been involved in some quite big pieces of research down where I am in Sussex area. You know, the number of women over 50 weren't even furloughed, just made unemployed. You know, quite early on in the pandemic, sort of April, May, the figures are just startling. There wasn't even a sense that there was value in keeping them within the business, and it seems to be disproportionately, women over 50. And so we're trying to work out why on earth that's happened.
Well, and this is one of the frustrating things. So often as an MP, look, we have very little power. You know, the actual only formal power I have is if there is a vote in Parliament, whether I walk into the yes or the no lobby or I don't vote at all. Everything else we do is essentially imagined. It's a sort of well, if I ask the question, what might happen? So a lot of what we're doing at the moment is trying to collaborate to get the government to engage in these questions at all. And sometimes talking about these issues, I always say it's a bit like talking Klingon. Like people might understand one word of it. So I'll ask a question about women's unemployment in Parliament and, you know, the Chancellor has heard the word woman. Mm-hmm. So he might talk to you about the gender pay gap, or he might talk to you about the fact that, you know, women can claim the £500 self-isolation. And I think that's not the question I asked, but because you said woman, that's the only bit of Klingon that they've understood.
Economic bingo.
And it's just really frustrating because these are problems that are eminently resolvable, right? This isn't actually some of the more intractable things that we might try and deal with in public life. You know, things like climate change are really hard. There are solutions, but they're quite radical. It's quite hard work. Some of this is really straightforward. Fundamentally, right now, nurseries can't take as many kids because you have to socially distance. I mean, if you want to try and keep apart a group of 3-year-olds, good luck to you. Mm-hmm. But that means that they can't have as many kids there, which means they don't have as much money coming in, which means that they're more financially vulnerable, which means they need a subsidy in the same way that we subsidise lots of other industries to make sure they can keep going into the new year, when hopefully people will be able to get back to normal because we'll have this vaccine and things will move back to normal.
And nurseries already...
Not a conversation that is happening in government at all. And yet, ironically, there is billions of pounds of money that's been committed to funding childcare that isn't being taken up because people can't get the places to be able to claim.
Well, I was just going to say, you know...
What does post-traumatic growth mean to you? 2020 is the year in which everything changed. We're in a time of rethinking the very nature of work, society, culture, education and economics. But what does that mean for you and your projects? Hosted by Always Possible, the Possibility Club is a safe space to think aloud about what comes next. If you're interested in shaping your ideas and learning from others, we are your tribe. It's free to join, with access to a wide network of thinkers and doers. Sign up today and you'll also get 1 month free access to our expert circles with in-depth and targeted support on a range of professional development topics from fundraising to project design to marketing. Join in the conversation at thepossibilityclub.org. That's thepossibilityclub.org.
The childcare industry already, needing to come to terms with how to balance the books with the 30 hours of funded childcare, which is a lovely principle, but actually economically works for very few of them in terms of what that actually pays for.
And it all interconnects, and I would love, because I'm very passionate about things like climate change, but I know that there is a big piece of work to be done to change fundamentally the ways in which we live our lives in order to be more sustainable. We can't start that work when we're dealing with these immediate crises. So when you see something which is actually really simple to solve, which is basically to switch the money from one pot to the other pot, and it's not happening, you get really frustrated because you think about all those people who are affected by it and all the time that's going to be spent trying to put right something that was so obvious it shouldn't need saying, but it does need saying because it ain't happening.
So you say you feel a bit powerless being an MP?
No, I didn't say I feel powerless, but I think
have much power.
It's important. One of the things I've always felt very strongly is sometimes there's this kind of mafia don idea about a politician. You come to me, I fix your problem. I'm this big, powerful, mysterious, or maybe Rasputin style. And actually that really disempowers my community. It disempowers the people I represent. And I'm from the cooperative part of the labour movement. So I passionately believe in giving people power. And part of that is about recognising the power they do have. You are powerful in your life, in advocating and telling your story and working with other people. But our political system is set up with the idea that 650 people in a place that looks a bit like Hogwarts gone wrong are the only people who can do anything if you're nice to them. And obviously, that argument is undermined by the fact that we've just had all this evidence that if you were a friend of a government MP, you are much more likely to get a contract to do PPE. But in general, it's not that I feel powerless. It's that the power I derive comes from working with people and empowering my community to take action together, rather than, you've told me, I'll go away. Here's my magic wand because I work in Hogwarts.
Fix a law.
Yeah,
absolutely. No,
although I am pretty sure I have seen Hagrid walking around the corridors in Parliament. I have to be honest. They're long and they're dark, and there's definitely some tall people in there with beards.
So what is it like at the moment? Simply the mechanics of Parliament. And as you said, there's procurement and tenders going out all over the shop. There's people who can't attend Parliament, but the leader of the House seems hell-bent that that's not important.
So I would always say a third of my time is spent in Westminster. And you're right, at the moment, it's a very strange place to be because a lot of people are proxied, lots of people who have family members who are clinically vulnerable or clinically vulnerable themselves, or people like me who are proxied for childcare because it's hard to get consistent childcare. But even if Parliament were running full time, another third of our time is very much about the communities that we serve and being able to spend time there. And then a third of the time is about the causes that you're trying to change and how you work either within your political movement or with campaign organisations. So actually, what's really frustrating is that only that third is even being talked about as what we do. So the childcare stuff and the stuff I've been doing advocacy is a good example of where I've been working with some brilliant organisations like the National Day Nurseries Association and Pregnant and Then Screwed to try and get the information to show what the impact is. And then you're looking at Parliament itself and going, well, where are the opportunities to express that? And you're right, because of the MOG rules. So we have the MOG Conga and the MOG rules. So the MOG rules say that I can ask a question, but I can't take part in a debate, as if there's somehow a difference between me appearing on a TV screen for a question, but not for a debate. We did have a time when you could take part in a debate. I had a wonderful day with the immigration debate, which I feel very strongly about the immigration bill. I thought it was a very bad piece of legislation. I was able to give a speech about it, to vote on it, and do bedtime and bath time all from the same room, which I think is the parental holy grail. But Parliament itself right now is a very strange place to be because not a lot of people are around, but we're all trying to use what opportunities there are to raise the things that we've been working at in the other 2/3 of our job. And if I give you just an example, I've had a 60% increase in the casework and the people coming to me asking for help in my community, because the pandemic is it's like the Monty Python foot just coming down on everything, and all your plans for your business, for your family, the job security that you thought you had. So that third in the middle, which is about just being an advocate in your community, that's massively expanded. The third, where you've got maybe opportunities and platforms to raise those issues, has shrunk. And then you've got the third where you're trying to problem solve with other MPs and campaign organisations. that we're all trying to do on Zoom. And, if I never hear the words, you're on mute again, it'll be too soon.
No, indeed. And I'm aware I said it to you at the very start of this, almost as have it tattooed on my forehead. Yeah, of course. And it's how all the different parts of our life are kind of holistically merging together. As you said, when I'm sat on my bedroom floor because I've been banished to the top of the house because my children came back from school earlier than I thought. My 6-year-old's in the bath. I can hear him already. And I'm doing this, talking to you. And in another world, I probably would have tried to come up to London and had a coffee. Is there any good that will come out of that? Do you feel that people in your constituency, perhaps they're asking for help in a way that they felt that they couldn't before?
I don't mean to be Pollyanna, but I think it's really important to recognise there are many crises taking place right now. The pandemic might be the one that's most visible within our eyesight at the moment, but don't forget the big ugly head of Brexit is about to rear itself again and start changing. So all those businesses who've struggled for the last year are going to find a hell of a lot more paperwork come December the 31st, whatever the Brexit deal is. I'm worried there might be more flooding. There's various forms of global instability around the world. So one of the things in that environment is actually a pandemic isn't that unusual in terms of a crisis that you need politics to be able to respond to. I wouldn't do this job if I didn't think change was possible. Right? Because otherwise you are setting yourself up to be the first person people scream about and the last person they write a rude tweet about at the end of the night. And that's not a good place to be for anybody. I mean, and the kind of people who enjoy that probably shouldn't be elected representatives. So I do this job because I genuinely believe that change is possible, but it does require people to be able to work together at a local, national, international level and to make decisions. And as we're seeing over the last 6 months, when you don't make those decisions or when those decisions are driven by questionable motives, let's put it like that, then actually things can get worse. It was a source of extreme pride for me that when the government said actually we're not going to fund the free school meals, within 24 hours my local community mobilised, working with the Salvation Army, our local food bank, various schools, and over the course of that week we think we fed about 600 families. Actually, some of the reasons we were able to do that is because over the last year I think people have recognised that when a crisis happens, you are better being able to work with your neighbours, to collaborate with them, whether it is helping people who are clinically vulnerable get hold of food or people wearing masks and people socially distancing, because actually we're all affected by this. Yeah. There's a great leveller in that. So what's fascinating to me is I think the appetite for how you work together has never been stronger. Yeah. The difficulty is, in 10 years of being an MP, look, when I was first elected in 2010, it was all a bit theoretical that you could change things. I absolutely know now how change happens. It's just bloody hard work. And so at this point in the pandemic, keeping people going, keeping people working together, recognizing that, it's not easy. Look, people are losing their jobs. Businesses are going to change. It is not going to be the same. But we are more likely to be able to get some better outcomes if we collaborate rather than decide, right, the next 6 months is about finding someone to blame, because that's what that kind of populist, almost Trumpian politics is about. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It's not like, come on, everybody, jolly hockey sticks, let's all pull together. The alternative is a chaos and an inequality that I don't think anybody, is not a world I want to live in. So keeping people's energies up, keeping people focused on what they can do and being honest with people about the options it gets harder, not easier, but it has more of an impact as it goes along. If that makes sense.
This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible. But who are we?
Always Possible is an energetic team with a proven track record of building ideas that work.
We use research, problem solving, design and storytelling to help transform society and to build businesses.
We give crucial support to organisations that care about the future.
From architects to aerospace companies, puppet theatres to primary schools, business networks to big data analysts.
Maybe you want to build your business in challenging times, or you want to build opportunities for communities. We help leaders work out what's next.
Find out more about how we could power up your mission. Visit alwayspossible.co.uk.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
It is that sort of universalism. People are all having different pandemics, of course, but it's that sense of there's a common enemy, which is not always seen like that. And it's not even the virus that's the biggest problem here. As you say, all of these fault lines were already there. All of these crises are endemic and are real. But what's happened in the last few months is that they've become very visible. It's exposed, I think, the inequality in a more acute way to people who could ignore it before. Whether it's the north-south divide or whether it's, people who are losing their jobs much, much more quickly than others, who are very vulnerable in the workforce, that sort of stuff. I think a lot of people just had no idea that there was such little resilience in parts of the economy. Now, you'd have known that. A lot of other people on the front line would have known that, but many people didn't. So I wonder if that now might be something that changes.
That's where you need political leadership, because there is a choice you can make. As I say, there's a very kind of Trumpian approach to politics, which is let's find somebody to blame for why life is shit. Yeah, and we've got it in British politics too. It's the immigrants, it's the EU, it's the Tories. It's the kind of let's just find somebody to be cross with, and by return, whoever is not in that category is the good guys. Mm-hmm. The trouble with that is it doesn't change anything. And as I say, I'm in the business of change. So what is really difficult at points like this is to help people channel their anger into action that actually does change things rather than is part of destruction. Because it's a hell of a lot easier to suggest destruction. It's a hell of a lot easier. And I think that's why, look, frankly, that's why conspiracy theories are so popular, isn't it? Because at least it implies that somebody had a plan. Yeah. I mean, if the truth is that you've got leadership around the world and in your local communities that is going, it's a pandemic, my God, did we have a plan for that?
Yeah.
As we all would, because this is something, once in a generation to deal with, it's much more, it's much more pleasing to a world that's lived on Netflix, isn't it? If actually there's somebody secretly organising all of this and it's all been a plot, and so maybe there's a cure and maybe there's a plan, and what you've got to do is pick the right side of that battle to be on.
More reassuring in a way.
The reality is life ain't Netflix, more than it wish it was,
Absolutely. And I think that is an example of things where people just sort of had no idea really what that actually meant for a lot of families, but because it's been brought to the surface, people are interrogating that a bit more.
But I also think people recognising that it was changing. I mean, I know people want to think of London as a place of affluence. I represent the community that has the 9th highest level of child poverty in the country, and it's because of the cost of housing in our community. You layer on top of that the pandemic. So I have a lot of people who are self-employed in Walthamstow, a lot of people who missed out on the government support because they didn't meet the criteria because they work in different ways. And actually what happened when that week came is that finally people were able to talk about it and recognise what was happening in our community. It's not that people don't know about it, is it doesn't necessarily become an explicit conversation that literally there were families for whom the 20 quid on the universal credit was the difference between eating for an entire week.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yes, I have people who've moved into my community who are obsessed with where do you get a good chai latte and write me long emails about the importance of independent shops, and don't disagree with them. But that's living alongside some extreme levels of poverty and inequality. What the pandemic has done, I think, is create a space in which people can have that conversation. I mean, also, I would say there's a lot of people who've been at home for a long period of time, and the thing that's really wound them up about their street, they finally had the time to write to their MP about. Yeah. I mean, there's just some of that as well.
But I think that's a good thing, and I just wonder, and I might be complete naive optimist, but I think some of the things that you've talked about there feel less acceptable to everybody now, and we have to do something about that. And I'm just sensing there are more people taking up that position than the usual kind of social activists and politically minded people. People
are having a conversation about what building back better is a phrase that people use, but there's nothing inevitable about that happening. I mean, I do think it is really important. I say, I don't mean to be Pollyanna about it, but experience teaches me that unless you actually put the hard yards in with the detail about what the alternatives could be, earlier this year, people were clapping for carers and everyone said, well, of course, we'll never go back to low wages in the public sector. And the Chancellor is going to announce next week a pay freeze in the public sector. There is nothing inevitable about progress in the same way there is nothing inevitable about a backlash. The point is you have to get stuck in and do something about it. The doing something about it is, I think, the thing that is difficult for people to understand. And as I say, I know it is bloody hard work because it's very easy for people to say, well, somebody should do something about it. And then they all turn around and they look at their MP and they go, you. And that's why I go back to what I said to you at the start about, it's not about feeling powerless, but it's about recognizing how power can be exercised. I am everybody's worst nightmare as their MP. And I always say that to people in Walthamstow because I get them involved. You know, I don't know how to change things on my own. I do know how to work with other people to achieve big transformative change.
So we've got a window where it's at the top of people's minds. How do we all bottle that up, bottle that energy, that permission, that...
So look, I think there's a really good and there's a really powerful case coming. An example of that would be for me, education, right? At the moment, we are looking at up to a 75% variation in attainment between people on the lowest incomes and the highest incomes during the pandemic, because basically, if you are a wealthy kid who was at private school, you probably had one-to-one tuition online. So actually, although you were stuck at home, it didn't have the same impact on your educational attainment to being a kid who might be in an overcrowded house, who doesn't have access to technology, whose school wasn't doing as much work. You know, it's not an either or. And as things continue on and our education is still quite fragmented, the gap is getting worse. Now, within education, the mistake people make with education is they always think it's a bit like going into a supermarket, and what you've got to do is pick the right type of education for your kid. Actually, education is like going into a nightclub. How the other people in the area, in the club experience it will affect your experience. So the more that we can do as communities to help make sure that our children are able to go back to school, give an extra support to catch up, the more every child will benefit from it. And I really hope that the next stage for the mutual aid groups, and absolutely, we're still in a second lockdown. We don't know quite when that'll finish, but I'd really love to see a mutual aid approach to education and tutoring and support so that we make a commitment as a community and as a country that no child will be left behind as a result of this pandemic. And that might be about online tuition. It might be about one-to-one support. It might be about after-school clubs. But if we can recognise that challenge and recognise that is a long-term piece of work that needs to happen, the fact that everybody was able to organise to make sure their neighbours get fed, you know, those WhatsApp groups shouldn't dissolve into people arguing about parking. They could be an opportunity for people to help support educational attainment in their communities. And that could be a really long-lasting difference from it. And that's not to undermine the role of schools or teachers. It's not to absent them. It's to say, actually, there is going to be such a potential gap. Collectively, we could fill it.
That feels very tangible, and schools, I think, would welcome that community approach. The question I often get asked by heads is how can we work better with the community, because often we're seen as a bit of a fortress. And
but we know that there are kids who will have missed swathes of education, and if we can organise ourselves to run food banks, we can organise ourselves to do tuition of those things.
Absolutely.
I actually think people do, they do listen to their neighbours, they do engage. And one of the challenges that we've got is how we ask people to be leaders. Our political culture, in the broadest sense, is very toxic in this country, and we all miss out as a result. It goes back to the only people who want to be involved are the kind of people who, so it's the people who enjoy trolling on social media, isn't it? Because they like the attention. So part of that for me isn't about people themselves, because it also goes back to, if we are honest, some of those trusted institutions you're talking about were not representative of the communities you want them to seek and serve. They were dominated by white men of a certain age. The two things go hand in hand. Thinking about how we do leadership on particular issues. I'm very mindful, for example, in my local community, when I think about educational attainment and who's been working on filling the gap. Within, for example, my local Somali community, it's women who lead those conversations because they are absolutely ruthlessly determined that their children should do better and should be able to compete within the British educational system. So they do a lot of after-school work. They don't do it in the format that we might traditionally recognise as educational opportunities and after-school clubs. They do it in a much more fragmented way. But that leads me to ask, well, if we recognise the value of community leadership in that way, why do we ask it to go and sit in long, boring meetings and write minutes? And, are there better ways of collaborating? Oh, sorry, my computer's on me out. Are there better ways of collaborating with our communities that would get the results that we want to? I have a rule when I do a community event in Walthamstow that it must never be longer than 90 minutes and there must always be cake, because those are the two things that would make me show up. We are not a country that's particularly good at that, ironically, because we've got lots of very good voluntary sector organisations. Before I was elected, I worked with the Scout Association. I was a youth worker. The Scout Association is an amazing organisation, mobilises 500,000 people every week to do amazing things with young people. It's doing loads of powerful stuff in the pandemic, but we're almost victims of our success in the UK, where we're so used to the model of what community leadership looks like that different models don't get the same support and attention, because we think, well, what we need is, 1 million Scout leaders. It'd be great to have 1 million Scout leaders, but also Mariam, who runs the group with the Somali kids, who does things in a different way, we need some more of her too.
No, we absolutely do. And I'm down on the South Coast, and I have been doing some work prior to the pandemic, actually, with my borough council down here, asking those very questions. But that comes back to my point about, well, is this a window or a moment to bring more people into that conversation? Actually, what I saw yesterday is my local authority are now advertising for, literally a kind of paid community organiser to do exactly that. So that's a commitment from the local authority to help enable and galvanise or create the conditions where that can happen. And that really excites me. And I'm sure, many, many other places are looking at the same.
And that's exciting. And it will be challenging, because if you get this stuff right, so one of the things that is difficult, why do I say I'm from the cooperative movement? Is because I'm comfortable with giving power away, but it's a very uncomfortable thing to do. Because it means that you can't control the outcomes, and you will be held accountable for them. So you're in a sort of double bind. My experience is if you treat people like grown-ups, they behave like them. And a lot of our politics and a lot of our policy making tends to treat people like toddlers who can't be trusted to make difficult decisions, or don't want to make difficult decisions because they don't want to come to the long, boring meetings. And so it is better not to involve them at all. We have a long way to go in this country. People talk about the community organising, so for community budgeting, for example, in various parts of the world, that took decades to embed as a way of working, because it was a different way of doing things, and it was a different culture of public service delivery. And actually in the UK, we've been so proud of our public services that to say, well, maybe there are different ways of working now is a challenge for people. And I can understand that, because change is a difficult thing to do. Like I said at the start, it's bloody hard work. It's just worthwhile. And in a pandemic, when everybody feels very uncertain, when things do feel very fragmented, it's even harder to make that case to people.
So going back to the Hogwarts gone wrong, which is to say is only a sort of a third of your role, really worrying about what happens there. But it is somewhere that people are looking at, through a magnifying glass. And will this make anything better in Parliament, do you think?
The pandemic?
Yeah. Will there be anything that doesn't return to the status quo this time next year?
Nothing is inevitable, but nothing is set in stone. So it could, there are absolutely people's experience of online working. Absolutely. For example, one thing that I think could change some of the things that Parliament does, but we're still trying to do it within the framework that the 650 people are the most important people in the room. How do we change the way in which we work, because we're changing the outcomes we're trying to achieve? So for people like me who want to work in different ways, I tried, for example, to make the argument around citizens' assemblies for Brexit as a way, because they're a sort of democratic circuit breaker when you get things stuck. And believe me, we were stuck for 2 years in this kind of rattle of people going round and round the same arguments. That in itself was more disconcerting for people than just going back to having another referendum, even though people recognised that the country was incredibly divided, because something that was new was more disconcerting to people than something which they knew, even if they think it didn't work.
Disconcerting for who? Politicians or
politicians?
Or people?
Yeah.
There's enough people talking about that, and even if politicians are disconcerted now, and you say nothing inevitable, of course, but are we not inching towards that? Are we not inching towards some big shift in the way that we make decisions?
Well, but that's what I mean about nothing is set in stone. My concern is that sadly the experimentation with Citizens' Assembly in Parliament to date has been very much about as a listening exercise rather than a decision-making exercise. And for me, there should be a way in which you can actually make decisions rather than, well, that was nice. Today we've had a discussion, but it doesn't change anything. Yeah. And I think it goes back to a more fundamental question about power and how things change. So look, absolutely these conversations are happening. Whilst they happen in a separate silo to the issues that we need to address as a society, they'll never truly achieve their potential. Mm-hmm. So the challenge for people like me who are passionate about distributing power because you get a better result is to join the dots for people and make it less of a technical autocratic conversation about citizens' assemblies and more about how do we solve a situation where everyone's at loggerheads. Because actually I think people get that. They get that people are at loggerheads in British society right now. When I first got elected, people who at least ask a question before they get angry. Now people start angry and then they ask the questions. That isn't sustainable. It could lead you to some very dark and dangerous places, as we saw in America. I think we will still see, we see in Europe, and we have seen in parts of the UK. But it also means a bit like the frustration of why are we still dealing with childcare when we know it's such an important thing, because we're not dealing with the basics and we want to get onto the big challenging questions. It's a lot of time wasted. Nothing is nailed till nothing is set in stone means just because we think this must lead to a better conversation about how do we revive our democracy doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen. It does require political will. And I mean, look, I'm a politician because I believe political movements and political parties play a massively important role in that, in bringing people together. Individually, I'm one voice. However cleverly I argue for something, it makes a limited amount of difference. Collectively, we can change the terms of the debate. So you need political movements to be more than a shouting shop or people slinging insults at each other, because there's so much work to be done changing the way in which we do stuff. That's why I haven't got time for the long, boring meetings where I would willingly chew my own arm off to leave early. There's so much more important stuff we've got to get done now. I wouldn't do this job if I didn't think things could change, because I'm not a masochist.
And if nothing else, we can have more and shorter meetings because of the technology now.
Well, you say that, but I've sat through 2 NEC now that have gone on for 3 hours. So actually the technology isn't what drives it, it's the will. That's why cake and time limits matter, because it's about valuing other people giving you time.
Here's to cake and time limits. Stella, thank you so much for your time. I've taken way more than I was allocated, so I really appreciate that. Fascinating conversation. And good luck changing the world. We need it.
Yes. There isn't an alternative, but it's bloody hard work. And that's why you have to keep going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Stella Creasy for her contribution at such a busy time. We'd planned for, and I'd been granted very generously, about 20-30 minutes, but we chatted for over an hour. I could have chatted for a lot longer. Thank you so much to Stella for that. If you are intrigued by some of the things that she said, I think certainly some of the stuff around community organising and where power lies and the decentralisation of power, I think is really interesting. And we're going to be talking a lot about that at the Possibility Club, which is our network, our hub, our safe space to think aloud for people who are curious about change. You can find that at thepossibilityclub.org. It's free to join, but I'll make sure that there's a link for that in the notes to this podcast. And I want to introduce to you as well something new that's coming around the corner, which is a weekly letter that I'm going to be putting together called Finding Chances, in which I explore in a bit more depth, informally, behind the scenes of business, culture, community and education, unpicking some of these conversations that I'm having through the podcasts with my own kind of thoughts and reflections on, along with further insights and observations from the reading I'm doing, from the consultancy and research that I'm doing, with some suggested reading and profiles and introductions to interesting people that you might want to check out. So 2 things there: the Possibility Club, where our big community is chattering, and then Finding Chances, which will be a subscription weekly letter that will drop into your inbox with some thoughts and ideas. Like I said, I'll put links to those both in the podcast so that you can join if you so wish. Thank you so much for checking back in with us at the beginning of what will be a better year, I promise you. Please do tell everybody about this podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then let us know. Write a review. Please do a little review on iTunes or on Spotify or whatever. Click the little 5-star thing. Really, really, really helpful to help us get the word spread out there. And if you've not caught up on the past episodes, please do. There's some crackers in there. fascinating, extraordinary people that it's been a privilege to talk to. So I think you'll like those. This is the Possibility Club, and it's an Always Possible podcast. And I've been Richard Freeman for Always Possible, and it has been produced with skill and dexterity, as always, by the wonderful Stella Creasy for Lo-Fi Arts. Thank you, thank you, thank you. In the words of Joe Biden, I'll see you again very, very soon. Lo-Fi Arts.